Good afternoon, everybody. Oki Goe Epsilazi. I'm very pleased to welcome you here and to see everybody here. Come on in. I'd like to acknowledge that we are in Métis Region 3 and that we are on Treaty 7 land, the traditional land of the Blackfoot people, specifically the Ghana or Kainai people. My name is Mara Hanrahan. I'm a member of the Geography Department and a Prentice Research Affiliate. I wanted to, before I introduce Dr. Young, our guest speaker, I'm going to tell you a little bit about upcoming events that the Prentice Institute has and other events that are going on with Prentice Institute affiliates. One of which is Dr. Ivan Townsend, also in geography, who will be speaking this afternoon. Who will be speaking next week, and Ivan's topic is an evolving geography of income equality, socio-spatial differences between the three cities of Calgary. So that sounds really interesting. That's November 2nd at noon here. The next talk after that is Dr. Peter Kellett from Health Sciences. I know that Peter does fascinating work. We don't yet have a title yet, but look for that. On December 7th, we will have Pascal Gazalian. Again, we don't have the topic for that yet, but it will be announced shortly. And one of the reasons that the email sheet is being passed around is so that you can be individually notified of these talks when the titles are decided and so on. So don't hesitate to sign the email sheet. The talk will be taped. The question and answer period will not be taped. No one attending will be on camera. Just Dr. Young and I will be on camera. And the video will be posted on the Prentice Institute website afterwards. And you're more than welcome to go and look at it and to share it with others as much as you wish. So at this stage, I'm very pleased to introduce my colleague, Dr. Julie Young. Dr. Young is Canada Research Chair, Tier 2, in Critical Border Studies, and she's an assistant professor in the Department of Geography here at the University of Lethbridge. Julie holds a doctorate in geography and a graduate diploma in refugee and migration studies from York University in Toronto. Her research program aims to better understand North America's borders in the context of broader global processes, as well as what local practices tell us about where, how, and for whom borders work. So it's hard to think of a more timely topic. Julie's work has been published in ACME, an international e-journal for critical geographies, Environment and Planning, Society and Space, Journal of International Migration and Integration, and Refuge, Canada's Journal on Refugees. Dr. Young became a Prentice Institute Research Affiliate in February of this year. And I'd really like to invite you to welcome Dr. Young here.
Thank you, Maura, and thank you to the Prentice Institute for the invitation and to all of you for coming today. I really look forward to speaking with you about some ideas that I've been thinking about, bringing together some different projects with some emerging projects. And so I really look forward to the discussion at the end, to receiving your feedback and your comments and your suggestions in relation to the topic. And just before I begin, I really want to insist on the importance of the acknowledgements that Maura did to open the session, especially given that I'm new to this part of the world and given the topics that I study, right? So when I'm talking about nation-state borders and talking about the movements of people across those borders, it's really important for me and for all of us to keep those sort of other contexts, those other sovereignties in mind. Right, and a question that I try to remember to ask myself is to think about whose sovereignties matter, right, and whose sovereignties are ignored, and whose borders matter at the end of the day. Okay. So this recent mailer from our Member of Parliament, Rachel Harder, you probably received it in your mailboxes a couple weeks ago, talks about borders as absolutes. Right, as lines on the ground that demarcate state territories and express sovereignty, define insiders from outsiders. But I call myself a critical border studies person. And to me, what critical border studies means is that we need to complicate that understanding of borders, right? That borders are much more complex than just these lines on the ground that separate the territories of different nation states. right? So in this sense, borders are understood as a set of practices, but also as ongoing processes, right, and construction zones, right? And they're carried out by a range of actors in a whole host of spaces and relationships. So while I mostly work in communities around nation-state borders, I pay attention to the different actors, sites, and approaches to these borders, thinking about where, how, and for whom borders work. And for me, this requires me to work at more intimate, grounded, everyday scales and engage with lived experiences of the border that's woven into the fabric of everyday life. Right? And so my focus, because I'm a geographer, I like to think about scale. I think it's really important to think about the different scales of social issues and social structures. And so my focus is really on the interplay between two main levels of analysis. Right? On one hand, the regulation and facilitation of migration, both legislated and ground level, explicit and implied, that keeps border spaces paradoxically open and closed simultaneously. And I also think it's really important to think about the ways in which people organize their lives and livelihoods in relation to those international boundary lines, and often ignore or contest or refuse the presence of the border in their day-to-day lives. Okay, so now let me tell you about Olivia. Olivia is a woman that I've come to know through a project that I've done with colleagues in Mexico and Canada over the last 5 years. She's originally from Honduras, but she's lived in a small town near the Mexico-Guatemala border for the last 10 years. Right? And over this time, she's worked in bars, she's worked as a sex worker, she is now an owner of a bar, and so she has plays a number of different roles in the economy of this area and has experienced the border in a number of different ways. Right? And so she says, local immigration officials came to talk to me, and I told them, I'm sorry, I'm not going to tell you that I'm Mexican. I'm Honduran, and tomorrow I will come back. I'll be in front of you. That's how fast I will return. Why don't you give me a chance to live here a year or two? I don't know. I'll try to arrange my paperwork, but I will not leave this place. My son is buried here, and the other son is in therapy. I'm not doing any harm, and furthermore, I have my gravesite. I'm going to stay here with my tomb. This comment made them laugh because they thought it was funny that I have a grave ready for when I die here. And I think it's really important to begin with Olivia's words and from this other border that's connected to the border that I'm really going to focus on today, because her words really capture the role of the border in her everyday life, right? It's intimately tied into the choices that she feels are available to her. A key feature of her life in southern Mexico is her precarious legal status, right? She doesn't have Mexican paperwork to live and work in that area. And so this makes her vulnerable to exploitation and violence, but she also navigates this border space in ways that make it possible for her to provide for her family and herself. And from her words, we get a sense of how this border, the Mexico-Guatemala border, works. It's simultaneously highly controlled and capriciously porous, right, or relatively porous. Since we learn that it's not the first time that she's been faced with the possibility of deportation, and that both she and the border officials understand how easy it will be for her to return. And I think that I start with this story, or with Olivia's words, because I think it also gives us, we start to get a sense of how productive border zones can be. Right? They're really interesting places, and they're productive from both theoretical and empirical standpoints, right? Because of the proliferation of actors and spaces and relationships involved in making them work. Paulo Novak and others have referred to the productive tension of the border, and I think that's a really important concept in thinking about the relationships between the different borders in North America. Now, this is the same border that Olivia is talking about, but it's an image from over this weekend, right? And it's fair to say that people from all sides have been talking about this particular movement of people. This is at the Mexico-Guatemala border over the Suchiate River. I know a lot of non-geographers think about north as up and south as down. This picture is reversed, right? So south is at the top, Guatemala is at the top of that image, and Mexico is at the bottom. Right? And it's fair to say that people have been talking about this as a crisis, right? And I'm going to link the crisis at this border, or the sense of a crisis at this border, to the sense of a crisis at the Canada-US border. right? So I'm going to talk about the connections between these borders and how the mobilization of this idea of crisis influences our ability to respond. It influences the ways in which these situations are understood. And I'm going to flag it here, a note of caution in relation to thinking about this border, right? It's really important for us to keep in mind that what's happening at this border right now implicates Canada and the United States, right? Because both countries over the last 10 years in particular have made significant investments in terms of personnel and resources and equipment and training to strongly encourage Mexico to enforce its border on their behalf. Right, so I'm flagging that now, and I'll return to it a bit later. So I think at this point, what I'm thinking about is likely going to become a book project. I'm inspired by two previous research projects and thinking about the connections between them, but I'm also thinking about some new work that's just now getting underway, and Rabindra is a graduate student who's working with me on one of them, so thanks for coming. So really briefly, I'm pulling together or inspired by my dissertation research on the sort of represented on the left here, where I focused on, one of the previous refugee crises at the Canada-US border, the 1980s context, where Salvadorans and Guatemalans were all of a sudden flooding into Canada, right? There's similar kinds of narratives. And I looked specifically at the negotiation of that border by local advocates in the Detroit-Windsor area. Right, so I was thinking about the ways in which their actions reframed how that border actually worked at that time. Since that time, I've been doing this collaborative project in a small community near the Mexico-Guatemala border, but there are ways in which I was starting to see connections between them, both because of the people who are moving, right, still Central Americans, but in a contemporary context, but also because I was starting to see the real impact of US and Canadian border control practices in these regions. Right, so I'm drawing the inspiration from, or these are my points of entry into thinking about the relationships between these two borders. But I've really been thinking about the connections between these borders and projects a lot over the past couple of years, right? Especially starting in January 2017, when people first started walking across the border in Emerson, Manitoba, and then sort of attention to it ramped up over the past year or so. So the focus in coverage of this more recent situation at the Canada-US border has emphasized a sense of crisis, right? And certainly the numbers at times have been much higher than usual. But what I'm arguing is that reliance on this sense of crisis suggests that the situation is unanticipated and short-term, right? And thinking about it in this way authorizes and even invites a sense of amnesia or erasure of the longer histories and wider geopolitics that help us to understand what's actually going on at this border. Bless you. So in talking about something like the border as archive, I want to connect these histories and geographies of contested border crossings and refugee deterrence practices across the region as a sort of counterweight to the crisis mode of governance that characterizes official and media responses. Right? And it's interesting because I've been thinking about this crisis mode of governance for maybe about a year now. And then I was just, in preparing for my class yesterday, I was rereading an article earlier this week by Jarrett Martineau. And he is talking about these exact ideas that I'm thinking about in the refugee and migration context, but he's talking about them in the indigenous sovereignty context. Right? So he uses almost the same phrasing. I've been talking about it as a crisis mode of governance. Martineau talks about it as a crisis-based mode of governance. But really, we're both talking about this modality of governance that governs through crisis, right? And sort of the work that governing through crisis can do. Now, Martineau highlights the importance of a cross-temporal analysis of these moments of crisis. And to this, I would add the importance of a scalar analysis, right, as a geographer. So thinking about the different times and spaces that contribute to constructing the idea of a crisis. But he argues that I don't know more in their response in a particular moment to the construction of a crisis around their activism. They sort of responded to the crisis mode of governance by outlining what the crisis was for them, right? So they responded to this construction of their activism as a moment of crisis for Canada by confronting the multiple colonial temporalities and contexts simultaneously. Right? So the immediate, the historical, and the present. He's really focusing on the timelines. In this case, the immediate was the imminent passage of Bill C-45 that was proposing to make changes to the Navigable Waters Act. So that was sort of the immediate tipping point. But they were also mobilizing the historical and ongoing abrogation of treaty and inherent rights. And then the present, right? So the sort of ongoing present of colonial violence and racism and social suffering, right? And so I think I take some inspiration from the ways in which Martineau was not only trying to theorize crisis as a mode of governance, but the ways in which, through his study of Indigenous activism, he found that they were actually reframing the crisis through the ways in which they were responding. So that's sort of something that I'm going to try to incorporate as I move forward in thinking about this project. So what's the crisis that I'm particularly focused on at the moment? It's this crisis at our border, right, at the Canada-US border. We're starting in January 2017. We've seen higher than usual numbers of people crossing the Canada-US border irregularly, right? And the sense of crisis was really underscored, I would say, last summer, summer of 2017, by the movement of thousands of US residents of Haitian descent over the border into Quebec. Right? I was in Guatemala at the time, and all of a sudden I got a news notification that Montreal's Olympic Stadium was being repurposed as a refugee camp, and I was just like, what is going on in Canada, right? But so there was really this sort of militarized and large-scale response to the arrival of the Haitians at the time. And then later in the year, Canadian officials started to raise concerns about the dramatic increase in claims by people who were from Nigeria. And actually my honors thesis student, Wael Nasser, focused on that for his honors thesis this past year. So you should track him down if you have questions about that. But there is a growing concern that Salvadorans and certain other groups might be next, due to the large population of undocumented people of Salvadoran descent in the United States. Just less than 200,000 of them have a temporary protected status. And the announcement in January 2018 that their TPS, temporary protected status, would not be renewed, right? So it will expire in September of 2019. And now in response to the crisis that was happening at the time, the Canadian government initiated, in addition to talking about it a lot in the media, they initiated quite an interesting and creative campaign to try to deter additional people from arriving. Right? They focused on these irregular border crossings, depicting them as unruly and improper and need of management. Right? And you can see this reporting from September of last year, where Liberal MP Pablo Rodriguez was sent to Los Angeles to dissuade additional arrivals of US-based asylum seekers at the Canada-US border. Right? He said, in order to immigrate to Canada, the proper rules and processes have to be followed. Right? And additional delegations of MPs have since gone to other major cities in the US, to cities including Miami, Houston, New York, and Washington, D.C., right, to meet with local officials and members of community organizations. And the stated goal of these delegations was, in the words of Member of Parliament Emmanuel Dubourg, who's originally from Haiti, was to try to dissuade asylum seekers from Haiti, Central America, and elsewhere from arriving in Canada. Right? So in his words, he said, quote, they should use the right channels to come to Canada instead of crossing in between borders. Right? It's sort of an interesting geography when you're talking about the Canada-US border. People are crossing in between borders. And so these delegations are part of the way in which the Canadian government was responding and governing through the sense of crisis. But part of my interest in sort of what's been happening around this border over the past year, and in thinking about the connections between these different moments, is that what's been happening over the past year is highly reminiscent of what was happening in the late 1980s, right, which is what I was just mentioning earlier, in the context of the Central American refugee crisis of that time. Right? And so in both cases, we can identify an immediate tipping point, right? So sort of going back to Martineau's framing of it, the immediate sort of moment of the crisis. And in both cases, they were due to shifts in U.S. policy. So a U.S. policy shifted, and people got concerned about their safety and security and decided to take their chances in Canada, right? But moreover, there are really echoes of the 1980s context, especially in the media coverage, right, of both periods, talking about people on the move as a problem to be managed, right? Focusing on the undocumented status of people who were arriving from the US, and then looking at this evidence of people actually coming to the border and even crossing it in the more contemporary case as evidence that they were not following the rules, right, of Canada's asylum system. And so it was in this sense, in seeing these sort of echoes between those two cases, that I started to think about this idea of the border as archive, right? This metaphor draws from both archival research methods and emphasizes that border crossings are always contested, right? And so in terms of thinking about archival research and how it's relevant to thinking about borders, Moore has described archival research as a reconstruction, right? In the sense that it's always partial and incomplete, and often what's not included in the archives is as important as what is, right? So it's important to think about what is actually archived, what is actually remembered. But also that it's iterative, right? That the process of doing archival research is iterative. So we're reading documents and histories together, and we're returning and reading them in conjunction with one another. I'm also thinking about border as archive in terms of thinking about animating the border, right? So thinking about the border as an archive brings the lives of the border and border control policies and practices into view, right? How bordering policies actually work out in practice, and then maybe sometimes strategic and sometimes unintended consequences of those policies. And I think it also reminds us that the border is an ongoing project, certainly an ongoing project of settler colonialism in thinking about the Canada-US border, but also more broadly an ongoing project of nationalism, right? Of defining what the Canadian nation is and who it's for. Now, in thinking about the border as an archive, there are two key challenges. Right? So the first is that nation states are much more conscientious about saving their records and archiving their records than are regular people. So when I was studying the social movements in the 1980s, it was really difficult to track down those records. So if any of you are members of social movements, I would encourage you to think about the records that you might be generating and the knowledge that you're generating, right? So there are questions about both voice and volume, right? Whose stories are told and by whom, and what is heard when we're telling stories about the border. But another really important part of the context when we're talking about borders is that borders are increasingly on the move, right? They're not necessarily where we think they are. States put their borders on the move through space and time in order to try to preempt the arrivals of unwanted migrants, right? Stockdale has referred to this as the politics of anticipatory governance. Right? So in the present example, we also need to be asking, where is the Canada-US border, and where do its impacts actually materialize? And so to me, there are at least three key contexts, or three key points of entry to understand and address the contexts of the contemporary moment of crisis at the Canada-US border. So the first is the Safe Third Country Agreement. How many of you are actually familiar with this agreement? Does anyone want to give a try at explaining how it works? Exactly. So in this case, there are a number of examples around the world, but in this case, Canada has an agreement with the United States that says if someone arrives to Canada but has traveled via the United States, they will not be allowed to make their refugee claim in Canada, and they will be forced to go back to the United States to make their claim. Okay? So that's the general policy, but in fact, it has a really interesting geographical variation in its application, right? In the sense that it only applies at land border crossings and airports, right? And so it helped to foster and indeed create the situation that has seen a number of people crossing at unofficial border crossings. And I think that's probably what Du Bois was referencing when he said in between, people crossing in between borders. And so, right, so it's really important, although Canadian officials emphasize that people are arriving via the wrong routes, right, or not following the rules, in fact, they are, right? People talk about it as a loophole, but really it's a route that's been created through how the policy actually applies, right? That it's not surprising that people are crossing the border in these unofficial areas because the policy allows that, right? So that's a really important part of the geography that we need to understand. In terms of thinking about why people might be considering leaving the United States and their temporary protected status, you know, it's been framed as almost a benevolent act of the U.S. government, right? That a policy that is applied to people who are in trouble or whose homelands are in trouble and they will not be able to return, right, due to conflict or due to natural disasters. But it's really important to remember the longer history of struggle that led to the development of this policy, right? The TPS program was first enacted by Congress in 1990, but it was prompted by advocacy efforts by the wider sanctuary movement that was highly active throughout the United States in the 1980s and 1990s, and through a specific legal action, right? The American Baptist Churches case, which was a national class action lawsuit filed in May 1985 by more than 80 religious and refugee organizations. And it charged that the Reagan administration's policy of routinely denying Salvadoran and Guatemalan requests for asylum was in violation of the U.S. Refugee Act at the time, right? So that it was in violation of U.S. law. And the decision in 1991 found biased adjudication of Salvadoran and Guatemalan asylum applications and ordered the reconsideration of these applications. Right, so it's really important to understand this context, right, and the struggles that led to the official sort of policy and status of temporary protective status, because it has a much longer history than the current reporting on it would suggest. And then a final really important element of the geography of understanding the crisis at the Canada-US border is to think about the other borders that are connected to it, right? To think about the importance of the Mexico-Guatemala border and the US-Mexico border in between to what's going on at the Canada-US border. Because the contemporary moment of crisis is connected to the legacies of these earlier conflicts. And moreover, in the San Jose Action Statement, which Canada and the United States signed in August of 2016, Canada committed, along with 8 other North and Central American countries, to a regional approach to the Central American refugee crisis. Right? So at one level, there was actually a recognition of the need for protection for people fleeing violence in the Northern Triangle countries, right, of Nicaragua, Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, which makes the campaign to try to prevent people from arriving in Canada quite troubling, right? That Canada's recognizing the need for protection for refugees from those countries. And at the same time, Canada and the US are also operating at the other end of this crisis, right, as I signaled earlier, through their efforts and involvement in enforcing the Mexico-Guatemala border. And specifically, Canada has invested a significant amount of resources in terms of personnel through the anti-crime capacity building program, which essentially deploys Canadian trainers and resources towards Mexico's southern border to encourage Mexico to better enforce that border so that it will in turn shape who is able to come to Canada. And so I'm arguing that these moments of crisis at the border are a bit of a diversion from understanding the broader contexts at play, right? And we need to focus on the importance of spaces and dynamics that are produced by bordering practices over time. But also I think, and taking inspiration from Martineau's work, that these moments of crisis are also really important theoretical and political moments for broader discussions about displacement and borders in North America, which includes the reality that US officials now consider the Mexico-Guatemala border their southern border, right? The ongoing harmonization of Canadian and US policies, not only at the border between Canada and the US, but also regionally. the construction of Mexico as the focus of regional migration management practices, and the indigenous territories that are written over by this border and the practices that enforce it, right? And the ways in which these borders are actively resisted and refused in some cases. And I think all of those that I haven't directly talked about factor into how we ought to understand these irregular border crossings and the crisis mode of governance that characterizes the official response. Now, a recent issue of the journal Refuge, which is open access, so it's a great resource if you do work in this area, was on feminist interventions in the refugee crisis. And it raised two really productive questions that I'm starting to think about. One is that one woman, Nyack, suggested that our task is actually not to try to resolve the crisis, but to inhabit the crisis. And this I sort of take to mean to think about whose crisis we're talking about and for whom, a crisis for whom, right? And Characterized and her colleagues also ask another really important question: what remains once the crisis is declared over? Right? So what happens after this crisis mode of governance is no longer being applied? So moving forward, I'm also thinking about this question: what would an archive of the border look like? Right? And when I'm talking about border as archive, I'm talking about the importance of paying attention to the work that the border does and also the work that is done in the name of the border. And I'm also talking about animating the border, so keeping the longer histories and wider geographies and geopolitics of a particular border in mind. And in starting to get at this question, right, so this is, as I said, it's some thinking in progress, and I really welcome your comments and your questions. But I have two projects that are in the early stages. One is a Shirk Insight development grant that I'm just starting to work on with Ravindra and Well, where we're looking at how the Canadian government conceptualizes and operationalizes its refugee deterrence policies. And then later we're going to do some work in the Detroit, Windsor, and Leamington areas to look at the impacts of these policies on the ground in a city and its rural counterpart that have a long history of migration from Central America and Mexico. And we're also awaiting the results of a National Geographic Documenting Human Migration program project, which will focus on doing oral histories and perhaps creating a traveling exhibit that will tell this, sort of capture some of these lived experiences of contested border crossings, both from the 1980s period and this contemporary period, focusing on Central Americans and Haitians. And so really a question that I'm trying to grapple with is, what do these contested border crossings tell us about the border itself and the politics that define, sustain, and transgress it?